Indira Gandhi National Open University, New Delhi, India. She is an established Indian English poet, creative writer, and folklorist. She is the author, editor of 16 books. She is the recipient of the Literary Award Gold Medal from the Honorable Vice President of India for her contribution to English studies. Her areas of research interest cover new literatures, critical theory, folklore, and culture studies, children's literature, children's literature and American literature. Now we invite you to share, to deliver your talk and share your experience with our virtual audience. Professor Nandini Sahu.
Yeah, thank you very much, madam, for this kind introduction. In fact, I don't have any paper. I don't have any PowerPoint. I will just share my experiences of designing programs, academic programs on folklore studies for various universities, including my own university. I'll just share my experiences today. Before I get into my discussion, I would thank the Center for Asian Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University for having given me this wonderful opportunity to talk to all of you this evening. And Professor Kiran and the chairperson of the center, Dr. Sonu and Dr. Shivaji Bhaskar, and everyone out there, whoever is in the audience to listen to me. I thank all of you before I begin my lecture. And I especially thank Dr. Shivaji Bhaskar, my colleague, for having introduced me to the Center for Russian Studies, JNU. And Kiran ma'am, of course, thank you very much. Well, so my topic today is bringing folklore to the university table. This is rather a topic which is close to my heart, and I feel a bit of emotional when I talk about it, because bringing folklore, the so-called marginal studies, to the mainstream, to the university table, had been a Herculean task for me and the people who have been associated with me, including Dr. Shivaji. It was really a deep challenge for all of us to bring folklore from the marginal to the mainstream, and you know, to introduce it as a part of our MA programs. So I will a little bit talk about that. In 2006, when I came to Indira Gandhi National Open University, world's largest university in terms of students intake and also in terms of the academic programs that we offer, we do a need assessment survey before we design and develop any kind of program. We do a need assessment survey. And I discovered that in our English department, in the School of Humanities where I belong to, we had all sorts of programs, including British literature, American literature, and everything. But we didn't have folk literature as a part of our MA English. And also in the university, across the schools and disciplines, I saw that not a single program did cater to the needs of the folklorists. So in 2007, I did a need assessment survey and designed and developed a 32 credits diploma program on folk literature, which was overwhelmingly accepted, received by the students. And then the program continued from 2009 till 2017. The diploma program continued, and we had students from all branches of study, not just literature students. I'm a professor of English, but I have students from medicine to engineering to performing arts to National School of Drama. Even some students are from Safdarjung Hospital and AIMS, and majorly students of English literature and foreign languages. We had students from all departments because folklore is truly interdisciplinary. And in 2017, when the diploma program was going successfully on the university table that I would be repeating, I proposed MEG 16, which is a part of our MA English. It's an elective course of our MA English in IGNOU. And again, it was a big challenge to justify why folklore. At every step, I had to go through the fire test. Why folklore? Why do you want to make folklore a part of your English studies? And I had to justify that at every step. That folklore, its rich cultural heritage, its importance in creating a pool of specialized folklorists and researchers in the area of study. It was a very big challenge, but ultimately, I succeeded in introducing MAG 16 as a part of our MA English. And again, that course has large intake. The students are overwhelmingly responding to that course as well. And last year in 2021, I took another major step. I upgraded that PG diploma in folklore studies, which was 32 credits, to a 64 credits complete MA program in folklore studies, MA FCS. If the students are sitting here, JNU students, then I would recommend just go to our university website and type program guide of MA FCS, and you will find the complete details of the syllabus and everything related to MA FCS on the website. So apart from that, I was also instrumental in introducing UGC NET examination, and also I'm coordinating the UGC NET examination on folk literature. So, uh, in a multiple way, different kinds of diploma programs, and then MA program, and then UGC NET examination, and a part of MA English. So from various parts, disciplines, I have introduced folk literature and folklore studies as a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary subject in the university. Apart from IGNOU, where I belong to, I have also introduced folk literature in several foreign universities, including the University of Mauritius and some other foreign universities, and also some South Indian universities. And currently, I'm working with quite a few universities, including universities in Delhi, and I'm a part of their board of studies to introduce folk literature as a part of the academic disciplines and their MA programs. So this is how probably I have been contributing in my small little way, in my squirrel way, to bring folklore to the university table. When Professor Kiran circulated this poster, and Nandini will be talking about introducing folklore to the university table, some people questioned me that, so do you mean to say that it was never there on the university table? No, it was very much there. But then to introduce folklore, folk literature as a part of our master's degree programs and UGC NET examination is definitely, certainly, unquestionably a very major and important step which we have introduced from our university. And Dr. Shivaji Bhaskar, who is a part of this lecture today, he has also contributed chapters to that MA program. And in IGNOU, when we design and develop a program, we don't just give a syllabus to the student, we also write the chapters for the students. Each chapter is minimum 5,000 words, and my course writers, researchers like Dr. Shivaji and many people, even some people from JNU, your university, Delhi University, all the important universities in the country and some in the world have contributed. The best brains in the world have contributed to the making of our MA folklore programs. So that is how we have created a pool of specialized folklorists, folklore researchers who have enriched our papers, our subjects. With that, I would also come back to how and why folklore is a part of the interdisciplinary research. Well, students, you know that interdisciplinary means working within a single discipline. So there was a time when researchers used to work within a single discipline, but that time is gone, that is passé. Now we are working on cross-disciplinary research methods. Cross-disciplinary means looking at one discipline from the perspective of another. So that is one thing. And multidisciplinary is people from different disciplines when they work together and each drawing on their disciplinary knowledge. That is, multidisciplinary. And interdisciplinary is integrating knowledge systems and methods from different areas of research, from different disciplines, and using a real synthesis approach, thesis and synthesis approach. And the transdisciplinary research is creating a unity of intellectual framework beyond the disciplinary perspectives. So the folklore programs that I am talking of now today are truly transdisciplinary research works. So that is how I can justify that in the Center for Russian Studies, I'm talking about folk literature. I'm talking about folklore studies. I would also talk about Vladimir Prov and how he has contributed to folklore research. I would slowly come to that. And when I talk about bringing folklore to the university table, I consider with all seriousness the national education policy. The national education policy, the 67 pages document, if you go through that carefully, you will see that the word language has been used 202 times. And the NEP document, which is very, very flexible and which is very enriching and inclusive, that talks about family languages, local languages, state languages, official languages of India, and international languages, our connection to the international languages. And then it also talks about the language death, the endangered languages, the dying languages of the world. You know, initially in the world, there were more than 6 lakh languages, and today there are only 6,000 languages, and within a couple of years, it has been predicted that the 6,000 languages will come to 3,000. So this is very, very alarming, an alarming situation. So this is where the role, the important contribution of folklorists and language specialists like you will come. You have to create archives through which you can preserve the dying and the endangered languages. So when I talk about endangered languages, I'm definitely reminded about the folk languages and the tribal languages. So when I was preparing this program, academic program, MA in Folklore and Culture Studies, I had to visit many language groups, endangered language groups, and I had to interview the last few speakers of important languages in the country and also in the world. I visited quite a few countries to take interviews with the last few speakers of different languages, and it was really, really difficult. It was challenging because I could not understand their tongue, neither they could understand my approach. So at that point, I had to use translators. So my engagement with folk literature, with folklore studies, also starts vis-a-vis translation studies, language studies, anthropological research, translation studies, and also literature. I'm a person of literature, as Professor Kiran already talked about my books. I'm a poet, a creative writer, and a teacher of English literature. So my engagement with folklore goes with translation, pedagogy, teaching, and research, and also creative writing. I include folklore as a part of my creative writing too. I have 2 folk poetry books. Sukama and Other Poems is one of my folk poetry books, and also Sita, my long narrative epic poem, where I have used a lot of folk Ramayans as a part of my research. I did 2 years research and visited the entire Ramayana map of the world from place to place. That is how I gathered complete information about the different folk and the classical Ramayans. And ultimately, I ended up writing a long poem, narrative poem titled Sita, a poem which you will find on Amazon and everywhere. So that poem is truly folk oriented. So my engagement with folk literature also is vis-a-vis creative writing. And then next, in today's lecture, I would also talk about folklore as knowledge production. So when I talk about folklore as knowledge production, I would emphasize the MA folk literature program of 64 credits that I have designed single-handedly, and also the MEG 16 MA English course as a part of MA English that I have designed. I would talk about the syllabi of all those courses, PG Diploma, MA, and MA English, all those courses, how we have tried to create knowledge system of the dying and the endangered cultures and folklores and use those as a part of our university syllabi. So that is how we have brought folklore to the university table, right? Yeah, and then I would be giving examples from ethnomusicology, one of the subjects which is really close to me, very, very favorite and close to me. Somewhere I read that the winner writes history. For example, in any big battle in the world, in any big war in the world, the winner writes history. Then what happens to the story of the loser, the so-called, quote unquote, the so-called loser, who writes their history? So the loser's history is written by the folklorists, by the singers, by the mendicants, people traveling from place to place, the oral singers. So ethnomusicology. If you go to West Bengal, to Kolkata, you will see that the bowl singers moved from Kolkata to Bolpur in the train. When I was doing my PhD, I used to travel in the trains, and The bold singers used to come to the train, and I would record their music. I would record the songs that they used to sing. And they used to sing about Maner Manush, the one concept. And that had influenced Rabindranath Tagore a lot. And I used to talk to those bold singers and take the meaning and the narrative of their music. So I would also talk about ethnomusicology, how ethnomusicology, or how music, folk songs have been a part of our history, the history of the so-called loser, or people who are not the powerful, people who are not the elite, their history, how it has come as a part of our folk literature, our oral literatures. I will talk about that. So when I talk about ethnomusicology, I will not avoid talking about the oral written continuum, or the oral written nexus. Now, nexus is a negative word if you go to the dictionary, but I would be using that vis-a-vis folk literature. Now, when I talk about the oral written continuum and the oral written nexus, I am reminded about a rigid approach to folklore. There is a school of thought, a group of folklorists, a school of thought who strongly believe that anything which is recorded, anything which is written down, loses its orality, thus it loses its folkloristic, its folk element. But I belong to another flexible school of thought of folklore. I'm a folklorist who is really flexible, and I believe in inclusivity. So in the MEG 16 and also in the MA in Folk Literature program that we are talking about, I have used part of the programs, one major portion of the programs deal with Western folk theories and also Indian folk and classical theories. And another part of the programs deal with the texts, text-based courses. For example, Gopinath Mohanty's Paraja, the Paraja tribe, or Pather Panchali, or A.K. Ramanujan's folk tales of India, or various Elvin's books. So many folk poems. So Paula Richmond's collection of oral tales or oral songs. So those texts, which are flexibly used folk literature as a part of their discussion and pedagogy. I have used those texts as a part of my MA and PG diploma syllabi. So that is how the texts which were museumized all these years, past many years, we have put folklore out there in a museum, glorified folklore from a distance. We have museumized folklore and romanticized folklore. But we have never had the courage and conviction to bring those subjects to the university tables. We had never had the inclination to teach those subjects to the students in the departments. So that is how, we have brought those subjects from the museums, from through ethnomusicology, through different discussions, and then we have used those as a part of our university table. So that is what makes me talk about the oral written continuum, the oral literatures which have become a part of our written literatures today. And today, folklore is one of the upcoming areas of research and pedagogy, along with MA folklore introduced in a few universities. I won't say many, but a few universities in India and a few universities in the world, and also the UGC NET examination. So, with this, we have brought folklore to the university table. I get a question from the folklorists that by doing folklore, what kind of employment possibilities are there? Uh, Folklore is creating a pool of specialized folklorists who can create a place for themselves in the fields of study like teaching and research departments in colleges and universities, libraries, museums, archives, historical associations, culture councils, and national centers for arts, publishing houses, and funding agencies, central and state government institutions, agriculture, rural sociology, extension, and medicine and nursing. See, medicine also, Ayurveda and Unani and folk medicines are there. So, medicines and nursing, women's studies, African and American studies, popular culture, English and foreign language departments, and the literature departments as translators, interpreters, curators, musicologists, teachers, artists, performers, and many more. So many, uh, mm, Employment facilities are there for the students who are studying folk literature today. Even film industry and TV channels also have high demand for folklorists. You go to our Hollywood and Bollywood movies, you will see a lot of folklore there, folk music there. Folk entrepreneurs are coming up in a big way as job creators and providers. And the programs that I'm talking about, they believe in creating self-reliant or Atmanirbhar Bharat today, self-reliant India, people who are job creators and not just people who would follow a given syllabus, but people who can create their own space in the world of research, pedagogy, and folklore. Now, if you ask me to define folklore, it's very, very difficult for me, being a folklorist myself for past 20 years, but still, I don't know that I will be able to define folklore in a very specific way for you. But for me, in a very narrow way, I would say folklore is a way of life. And it presents itself with the lifestyle, the habits, the behaviors, the cultural and the social conditions of different communities and individuals. It's found everywhere in your daily speech, in your customs, rituals, and rites, festivals, tales, stories, jokes, riddles, parables, fables, jests, performative art forms, dance, music, theater, cuisine, folk cuisine is there. So we have a project paper in the programs that I'm talking about. Students are working for their project papers on folk cuisine. So the endangered dishes that you don't find anymore. In the age of pizza and burger, you hardly find those folk cooking and traditional knowledge systems. And people are doing their project work on those kinds of folk cuisine and folk spices, tribal and folk Ayurveda medicines and spices. People are working on those. So this is how, probably we are preserving those drying traditions. We are creating an archive. So I am putting all that together in an archive, and I'm working on a project with the Ministry, of course, where I am putting the dying languages, dying cultures, dance, music, cuisine, cooking, spices, and medicines, everything in a very organized manner, in a very organized and in a very curative manner. I'm putting those things in that website. This subject is very, very broad based, and it is highly interdisciplinary and integrated. And you know that until about 4000 BC, all literatures were basically folk due to their orality. Writing developed between 4000 and 3000 BC in both Egypt and Mesopotamia. And thereafter, the written literatures, oral literatures, were slowly converted to the written literatures, and they rapidly spread from Asia, North Africa to the Mediterranean, and now to the rest of the world. So, folk literature, oral literatures were the origin of all the classical and the modern literatures. So, there is a thin line between the classical and the folk and the modern literatures. All three of them exchange hands, borrow from each other. So, this is the research point on the university tables today. How the dying cultures, and dying literatures have become the support system of the modern literatures in a big way. And folklore is closely associated with many allied disciplines like anthropology, literature, gender studies, ethnomusicology, linguistics, psychology, and even performance studies. So you go to different areas of research, and ultimately you see that folklore is the root. There will be a time after a few years, probably all branches of study, all subjects will come under this interdisciplinary approach to the knowledge system. That's how I believe. Maybe I'm dreaming very big, but this is a big dream that I'm going to fulfill. And in the academic programs on the university table, I would be repeating that I'm talking about the verbal expressions along with literature, including the stories, folk tales, epics, legends, poetry, riddles, other narratives like names, symbols, and the musical expressions like songs and instrumental music. Folk music is closely associated to different powerful instrumental music systems. And also we talk about movements like dance, plays, artistic forms, rituals, folk rituals are there. For every occasion in life, for every ritual, there is folk music. Bidai songs are there. When the girl goes from her parents' house to the in-laws' house, there are folk songs. For the birth of a child, there are folk songs. For the death of a person, there are Rudali songs. You know the Rudali songs, isn't it? So for every occasion, folklore provides some kind of music, some kind of performance. And there are tangible and intangible expressions in the courses that we talk about. And the tangible expressions, for example, so this glass is tangible, you can touch and feel it. So the folk artifacts, the products that you have, they are the tangible expressions, the folk forms like drawings, designs, paintings, body painting, tattoo. You all do tattoo, isn't it? Then pottery, terracotta, puppetry, mosaic, woodwork, metalware, jewelry, baskets, needlework, textiles, glassware, carpets, costumes, handicrafts, musical instruments, architectural forms, temples, things that are visible, things that you can touch. Those tangible folk forms are also a part of our courses, not just literature. And intangible expressions are the copyright and the gharana, through which those tangible folk forms or the methods, the manners of creating those are passed on from generation to generation. Music gharanas are there. So medicine, Ayurvedic medicine groups are there, families are there. So they pass on their art forms to the next generations through training. So train the trainer is an important part of national education policy, which folklore has taken up very seriously, training the trainers. And in our academic programs at IGNOU that we do here, we have academic counselors and we have course writers and experts who train each other. Folklore is inclusive and flexible. We believe in learning. Once I got into folklore, I I was humbled down by looking at the kind of art, music, and culture across the country, across the world. I humbled down and I started learning from the artists, from the performers, from people. So I became a people's person from a private person when I became a folklorist. So again, the copyright of the folklore or folklore studies, folklore research is very, very important, which is a part of our intangible cultural heritage. Copyright is very important. If you are students and researchers of folklore, I would recommend that whenever you use any kind of folk knowledge system of any community, you must give them the credit, the academic credit. And along with that only, you will be eligible to use those as a part of your research and pedagogy, which is very important and tricky and challenging. Well, so the programs that I'm talking about, they bring some central parts of the places, and we also talk about humanities, social sciences, philosophy, philology, sociology, science and technology studies, use of ICT. The national education policy talks a lot about the information and communication technology, use of ICT. For the preservation of the dying languages and cultures, we use ICT massively. So we also talk about those things in our academic programs. And as I already told you, that folklore is flexible, isn't it? Now, if you ask me what is folklore, as I said, it's a way of life. But I will go a little bit to the research and to the background, how folklore was brought to the university tables through the historiography of folklore. I would be giving a little bit information to the students here. The term folklore, it comes from the English word FOLC, folk, yeah, and LAR, folk, and lar, which means wisdom of the folk. The folk, the common mass. It was first introduced into British academic discourses. So it came to India at a much later stage. So European folklore research was the original folklore research, I would say, though we had our Natya Shastra kind of classical literature, which was hugely influenced by the people, by the people's cultures and literatures, but still folklore hadn't come as a part of our research and pedagogy until very recently. I will come to that. It was first introduced into the British academic discourse by William Thoms in 1846 to replace the term popular antiquities. And in 1846, it came to their university tables. He defined folklore as the traditional beliefs, legends, and customs which are current among the common people. So they talked about the common people and their literatures and their cultures. And in Mesoamerica, the Hispanic scholars, Hispanic folk literature, which is a part of our MA in folklore studies, I will also come to that. In Mesoamerica, the Hispanic scholars they preferred popular antiquities against folklore because of its association with colonial imperialism. And in Europe, within France, the culture populaire, which is a POPULARIE, populari, it was used, while the Germans like Hitler, they used Volkskunde, VOLKSKUNDE. That is the term they used for folklore. However, they were not very comfortable with the term and the way it was used by Hitler for political motives, for the political reasons. Many academic institutes in the Western countries, in Germany, they used regional ethnology. The term regional ethnology, it was a term which was commonly used in Scandinavia, and it was again used in all parts of Germany at that point of time. The German Volkskunde, the Swedish folk minne, and the Indian Lok Sahitya, all three imply slightly different meanings, and that the English term folklore cannot syncretize completely. The characteristics will be a little bit different, all three of them. While all this certainly contributed to the clarification of the nature of folklore, at the same time, they differed in their main issues, like the isolation of the unifying thread that joins jokes and myths, gestures and legends, costumes and music, oral and written literatures into a single category of knowledge. So all of them used these knowledge systems as a single category of knowledge. And slowly, the researchers, contemporary folklore researchers, they started doing their research on the similarities and the differences between the European, the Western, and the Eastern, the Indian folklore research. Now I'll come to the different phases of development of folklore research in India, how folklore was brought to the university tables in India. I will talk about that. Look at our Vedas, the great epics, and like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Upanishads and the Puranas, and the bulky anthologies of folklore like the Hitopadesha, Brihad Katha, Katha Sarit Sagar, and the Jataka tales. All of them they do exemplify the vibrancy of our oral and then further written traditional creativity in India since ancient times. Just now, I was telling you about Sita. When I wrote Sita, I had to read 300 Ramayans. Out of the 300 Ramayans, at least 280 were folk versions of the Ramayana. So the Ramayana was, or Mahabharata for that matter, they were originally oral tales. Different parts of the country or even world, they had different versions of the story of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Ultimately, all those folk versions influenced and the classical Ramayana was created ultimately, or the classical Mahabharata was created, which we are reading today as the authentic text. The fact that J. Grimm in 1835 he had postulated a connection between Indian and European mythology, and Max Muller he had detailed about it. Just go to the website and you check Max Muller and the contribution to folklore. You will see that the study of Indian folklore became essential to the development of folk theory in the later half of the 19th century. So second or the third part of 19th century was actually the period when we started talking about folklore research in India. While diffusion theory in UGC NET syllabus, students please go to the UGC NET syllabus and also to go to IGNOU MA FCS syllabus, you will find detailed information about the diffusion theory. This is no longer a central issue of folklore research. It has been diluted. It has been served in multiple ways in the interplay between the oral and the written versions, and it continues to have a special signifies for complex cultures like India, where oral and written traditions are so very symbolic. Uh, Whenever I talk about folk literature, I'm reminded about the great little traditions of the Western folk theories and the Margi and Desi folk theories of Indian culture. In the Western culture, there is a basic difference, a binary, between the great and the little traditions. Like you will see that the great traditions belong to the elite, to the generals, the kings, and the powerful. And the little traditions belong to the common people, and there is a clear distinction. But when you come to Indian literary scenario, you will find that there is no such easy binary. There is no such black and white. between the Margi and the Desi. Margi is the so-called elite, Desi is the so-called low or the folk culture. But if you look at Indian cultural system, Indian literature, then you will basically find that both Margi and Desi have equally contributed to the making of our culture, literature, and language. If you go to the Shiva Purana, you just read the Shiva Purana, you will see that the narration, the description of Lord Shiva is in the Sanskrit language, in the elite language, and the description and the narration of Sati, Parvati, is in the folk language, in the Deshi language, and both of them are such beautifully amalgamated, such nicely combined, that there is no basic difference between the Margi and the Desi traditions in Indian literature and culture. So that is where the academic programs that we are talking about today, that bringing folklore to the university table, we are bringing both our Margi and Desi cultures to the students, serving them in a platter, isn't it? Now, coming to the developmental phases of folklore research in India, when I said that in the initial phase, Indian folklore research was dominated, influenced by the philologists and linguists working in Sanskrit, Persian, or Arabic languages with little or direct knowledge of India. So that is the irony, that they had little direct knowledge of Indian folklore, but the credit must be given to them, which I have given in a couple of chapters, units in the MA folklore program, Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic traditions. And a very good scholar from JNU, a teacher of JNU, has written that chapter for me, Sanskrit, Persian, and Arabic influence in Indian folkloristic. That is really, really interesting and worth mentioning here. And the second phase, however, it was the Christian missionaries in Indian folkloristic. The Christian missionaries, they appeared on the stage as first batch of collectors and publishers of the first-hand resources of the Indian traditional cultural systems in various regions of India. So again, the credit goes to them, though guided by their interest of spreading Christianity, which I have read somewhere, that they ventured into the remote regions and collected information on rural traditional settings. The Anglo-Saxon fathers, they recorded all kinds of information, habits, customs, and traditions and rituals, etc., about their subject. I'm quoting. And in the old Deccan days, or Hindu fairy legends current in southern India, are the books like Hindu manners, customs, and ceremonies, or books like folk tales of Kashmir, or Hatim Tai's tales, or the folk songs of southern India. These are some of the missionary books. If you Google them, find the entire forms in the internet in google.com, you will find. So those books were basically they were published in 1897, 1850, like that, and they have talked extensively about Indian folk traditions. So that is the second phase, where the Christian missionaries did folklore research in India. So they were instrumental in making us the folklorists that we are today, isn't it? Next, some Orientalists, they also took the initiatives of setting up academic societies and important periodicals that contributed immensely in the scholarly attention which Indian cultural resources were receiving at that point of time. I would talk about the Asiatic Society founded by William Jones in 1784, which was so important, and the journals like Indian Antiquary and Journal of the Anthropological Study of Bombay, and such journals, they carried brief articles on oral narratives and other such genres of folklore in India. Again, I have taken this information from internet sources. And then the third phase of Indian folklore research, it started it it joined the methods of the preceding two that I talked, philology and field collection, field studies. Folklore is a very field oriented subject. If you want to be a folklorist, you have to be a field study researcher, isn't it? You have to visit place to place, from place to place. You have to take interviews with people, you have to take information from people. And in the recent decades of the 20th century, last century, and the series of studies on themes taken from the classical tales like Jatakas, Panchatantra, Hitopadesh, and Katha Sarit Sagar, they were brought out by the American Sanskrit scholars under the guidance of Morris Bloomfield, W. N. Brown, and there was a borrowing between the folk and classical traditions in India and also in European literatures. Indology studies or Indic studies, they are coming up in a big way today. Everyone is talking about Indology and Indic studies. So what do they mean? Through Indic studies and Indology studies, we not only talk about how Indian classical literatures and Indian Vedic studies have influenced the Western thoughts, but also we talk about how Indian folk literatures have influenced the Western literatures, the Western literary studies. Western archivists, they have taken massively from Indian folklorists. The modern folk tales, they are in most cases as old as their parallels in the classical literatures that A.K. Ramanujan has written in the introduction to the collection of the folk tales that is very, very famous. And the stories were composed orally, written down later on by the disciples, and then they were disseminated or they were passed on to us orally once again. So you see, the oral written nexus, when I talk about that nexus, basically it was oral. Later on, it was written down, and then once again, it was passed on from generation to generation orally because of the lack of translation. So, wherever there was a translator, a mediator between two folk languages, it was transmitted orally. For example, if I am a speaker of English and Odia, and I want to know a Bangla folk tale, then there should be a narrator in between. The Bangla folk expert would orally transmit his stories to me so that I can write it down in English, Hindi, or Odia. So that is how, translation studies and research, they are so very important in bringing folklore to the university tables, isn't it? And but anyway, I would say that despite the shortcomings of this transmission orally, Brown's work is important because it at least created interest in the folklorists and among the Indologists. And then next is a linguist, M.B. Emenio. He went to the fields in 1935 to 38, those 3 years, to make the first systematic collection of Indian oral traditions. And his research on the tribes of South India, it was very, very advanced in Indian folklore. Primarily, he was the first person to treat this important folk collection as a part of academic subjects and courses. And it was not directly derived from the classical models. Rather, it had a compositional technique, and the stylistic was very, very oral. And the dialogue, he had a dialogue with the contemporary researchers while he collected those folk tales, and he passed those on to the next level folklorist, Verrier Elwin. He is a part of my MA programs. I mean, I have taken his texts. He brought out 5 major works on folk songs, folk tales, myths from tribes in central and northeast India, Verrier Elwin, and several others on tribal art, customs, and religion. The contributions of both Emmanuel and Verrier Elwin are extremely useful for the students of foreign languages like your departments, and also to the Indian folkloristic. They present a comprehensive picture of the oral traditions of India. That is where we have started the complete folklore research in India. The fourth step was the field collection and oral tradition. It was not much pursued again until the 1950s, because once again the so-called mainstream studies came to the university tables, and folklore once again became a part of our marginal studies for reasons best known to you and me, for empowerment or for convenience or for many such things. Folklore once again became a part of our marginal studies. It took a backseat in the 1950s. It marks the fourth phase of our Indian folklore studies. And in this phase, anthropologists and language and literature specialists like you or me, they began to record the major genres of verbal folklore in most regions of India, which I have read in A.K. Ramanujan's book. And however, this portions of all research in India devoted to folklore during this period was very, very small, and it was usually subordinated to the larger purposes of ethnography or literary studies. So ethnomusicology, ethnography, and literary studies. So it was associated with only these three. After the primary role in the study of India from Britain and America in about 1950s, early 1950s, the priorities shifted uh, from folklore research to mainstream research, as I already told, and it became a mere collection of piecemeal descriptions for limited use. But theory and methods of folklore research were not very seriously brought to the Indian folklore. And at the same time, folklore research developed considerably in the fourth phase uh, during the World War II, though it suffered theoretically, but in the field study, it developed considerably during the World War II. In particular, the nationalist movement, it stimulated the new respect for folklore research in folk traditions, the search for ancient origins and the desire to present the pure heritages of a people became a part of the folklore. And the total amount of work accomplished in this period, the fourth stage, the Second World War period, uh, in the study of folklore was very, very solid in its foundation. Then post 1960, so 1950 to 60 was a transition period on the university tables. Post 1960s, Indian scholars, they turned to intensive first-hand field research in folklore studies. Stuart Blackburn and A.K. Ramanan should be given the credit, and they gave the credit to the Indian universities. It is a happy thing for me as a teacher of a university to share with you that the credit after 1960s is given to the university tables. And the development of Indian folklore, especially as an index, is given to the universities. The last decade of the 20th century, 1990 to 2000, it witnessed the fifth phase of the Indian folklore research. It was marked by extensive folk research field work, and it was a growing period of the body of publications in folklore. Many books came, many universities introduced certificates and diploma courses on folklore, but very few universities had or even have today the courage and conviction to introduce a complete MA program in folklore, thinking about employability. So this is where the importance of the policy planners will come. When we talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, we have to think about the folklorists in a big way, how the folklorists and the trained scholars, researchers of folklore can be given employment, because without employment, research and pedagogy will be of no use. And you know, and I too know that. And this is where foreign languages departments like yours or the School of Foreign Language, where I had been the director last 3 years, will come. That we have to create comparative research between Indian languages and world languages. And I'm happy to share here that Dr. Shivaji, who is a part of this webinar today, is designing MA in Russian studies, Russian literature in the School of Foreign Languages, where he is taking major portions of folklore research from Russia and India as a comparative analysis. And I'm sure that he's taking support and help from the scholars from JNU like you all. I'm sure that he's collaborating with you. So this is definitely a happy thing to share here, isn't it? Now, consequently, the conceptual basis of the field studies of folklore, it started shifting during the late 20th century. Ethnographic and linguistic skills in South Asian research, they have now become very rich. They have been enriched by the comparative research, like I just told you, and importance is given, focus is given to folk literature. Just you open the UGC NET syllabus and you will see an extensive idea and extensive syllabus on folk literature of different parts of the world. Cinderella tales are there, Hispanic folklore is there, Russian folklore is there, and then Indian folkloristic, Margi, Desi, classical, and folk literatures. Everything is there. And now folklore has shifted from museums and archives to the university tables and to UGC for that matter. And today, when I'm talking to you about folklore research, my focus is basically on folklore as a pedagogical method, and then use of folk literature in teaching of English literature. But yeah, I, being a teacher of English literature, I certainly give a lot of importance to teaching of English literature, making folklore my tool, and use of technology. in teaching of folklore or in preservation of folklore. When I talked about the tangible and the intangible cultural heritages and how to preserve those, I certainly talk about the use of ICT, information and communication technology, for the preservation of folklore, right? And then in the courses, I also talk about folk as alternative epistemology. There are chapters where you talk about folk as alternative epistemology and folklore as alternative modernity. I have two books published, Folklore and the Alternative Modernities. You can just Google those books. When I talk about the contemporary narratives in Indian literature, in world literature, in folk literatures, and how folklore is serving the purpose of being an alternative modernity for me and you. So that is where. And then basically, when I talk about folklore as a written literature, I never forget the oral written continuum and the oral written nexus of folklore. And time is the touchstone. Time is the touchstone to preserve folklore. And my research points in the design and development of folk literature and folklore studies as a part of our academic programs have always been the long oral narratives and the short oral narratives in folklore. The research points have been how verbal and non-verbal literary forms can be related to one another vis-a-vis the oral written nexus. That has always been the research point for me. And that is how I have trained my course writers to write the chapters, the units that we call those units in our ecosystem, to write about the oral and written nexus and talk about the different folkloristics and folklore researches in different parts of the world and make a comparative analysis. I theorize my arguments with a few poems from books by Paula Richman, Ramayan Stories in Modern South India, the University of California. I have taken extensively from that. Poems like Do You Accept My Truth, My Lord? This is one poem. From Sita's Powers by Leela Prasad. And Everyone Has Anxieties, Lakshmana's Love, translated from Telugu by V.N. Rao. So a lot of translated texts from folk literatures. Well, we have Indian writing in English, but we do not have Indian literature in Indian writing in folklore or any Indian folk literature in English. We do not have any such genre. So when you talk about folklore in India, you talk about translation without any doubt. So these poems, extensively from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, and even from Andaman and Nicobar tribal communities, I have taken stories and folk tales, and I have used those through translation, research, and pedagogy, and put those on the university tables. My dialogue has been the culture and gender elements are treated differently, realistically, contextually with social relevance in the oral Ramayans as a binary to the deification and glorification of certain characters in the written Ramayans. In folk literatures, there is no glorification of the characters from the mythologies. Folk characters like folk Rama, folk Sita, or for that matter, folk Draupadi or folk Ravan, they are real characters like you and me, with all the strengths and weaknesses in their character. Like in a folk Ramayana, Sita is questioning that why did I believe in a golden deer? Nature will never produce a golden deer, but I run after a golden deer, thereby causing so much. So, folk characters from Indian mythologies are real characters. They have all the weaknesses. They are like you and me. But in elite literatures, they are presented in a much different manner with whom you cannot connect. They are forever young, forever beautiful. The other day, one of my friends was telling me that why gods and goddesses never grow old and they don't have beard and mustaches or anything. So I was just laughing that in classical literatures, they are presented in a way perfect, flawless. They are not like you and me. But in the folk literatures, they are presented with all the flaws in their characters and in their skin. Yeah. So those things are a part of folk literatures. For that matter, I take the theoretical route to many mythical tales and many folk tales with new historicist and cultural materialist point of view. Students, if you really want to be a folklorist, you anyway have to read structuralism and post-structuralism to understand the languages. But at the same time, I would recommend please read New Historicism and Cultural Materialism. New Historicism, parallel reading of two texts. So when you read a text of folk literature, you have to read texts of history, gender studies, anthropology, museum studies. So many things you have to read for a comparative analysis. So parallel reading of the texts, simplistically speaking, is the new historicism. There are multiple layers to that. I'll come to that. And if you are a cultural materialist, when I go to my MPhil PhD coursework sessions, my students always call me, cultural materialistic ma'am has come. So, I am very, very influenced by that. When you talk about folk literary text, you have to think about the different cultural systems, heritages of that particular period. If I'm talking about a folk text of the 18th century or the 19th century, for that matter, I have to think about the tribal lore, the folklore, the oral songs and dance systems, the theater, the folk theaters of that period, and even the folk medicines, the folk cuisine of that period. I have to understand all kinds of cultural heritages of that period so that I can understand the history of that text, the historiography of that text. So, if you are a folklorist, you have to study cultural materialism, isn't it? So, I theorize my texts with that. And when we talk about the folk and the modern narratives, the oral song narratives, uh, I take examples from different folk tales which have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Don't think that oral tales do not have a beginning, middle, and an end. They certainly have. And they talk about the different parts of life, the different concepts of life. And but how much time do I have, Professor Kiran? Do I have time now, or I should conclude? How much time do I have? Do you want me to conclude?
You're not audible, Kiran.
Kiran ma'am, you are not audible. You are on.
Yeah. Do I want me to conclude? I can conclude, or if you want me to continue, I can continue.
I think you should continue. It's very interesting.
Yes.
Take your time.
Yeah, thank you.
That's true. It is interesting.
Okay, I can actually go on and on till tomorrow morning.
Please
So
go on and on.
okay. Fine then. So let's come back. I'm sorry I broke your that seriousness of listening to me. Yeah, fine. Let's get back. Can I sip some water? Okay, so folk tales are similar to myths in a way. Like folk tales, myths are also based on oral narratives, and they too are from the different forms of the stories. Folk narratives have a sequence, as I told you. Like Aristotle, he says that it should have a beginning, middle, and an end in classical literatures. Even folk literatures have a beginning, middle, and an end, if you look at it carefully. During this International Women's Day celebrations, I got a call from a researcher from Russia who was talking to me. Now, you are from the Russian center, so you will take interest in this. A researcher called me from the Russian department, and he told me that they have protest literature as a part of their folklore. During Women's Day celebrations in Russia, like you remember Indian folk tradition of the Latmar festival. On the holy celebration, the woman will take a lat, a stick, and hit the man in the Latmar festivals. Perhaps all of you have heard about it. And on the holy day, holy celebration, the man cannot say no to the beating of the lat, of the stick. He has to keep quiet and digest the hitting of the woman, isn't it? You know about that Latmar festival. Professor Kiran, she's smiling, so probably she knows. Okay. So, in the Russian cultural system, on the International Women's Day celebration, they also have this kind of a tradition that women, so Professor Kiran and me, two women, we will dress up like man and wife. And then suppose I am dressed up as the man and she is dressed up as the wife in the disguise, and it's a theatrical performance, and then I would be kind of abusing her and hitting her and maybe molesting or doing whatever, something very, very negative I would be doing to her, and she would be silently taking that in, maybe crying, or maybe silently she would be taking that in. So this is a very subdued and a very interesting way of protest literature. Men folk would be sitting in the audience. No man is allowed to go to the stage on the Women's Day celebration. So two women or a group of women would be performing, would be hitting the wife. So Nandini, the husband, would be hitting wife Professor Kiran, and then the audience, the men folk would be watching that. And these women make them feel how they feel about them when they marginalize them or when they abuse or molest them, how they feel. Well, by saying that, I'm not claiming that men are abusers. I certainly don't. I work a lot on masculinity studies, and I quite stand for gender studies and masculinity studies, and I do a lot of research, and I have wonderful men in my life. Men are not abusers. But at the same time, if women want to protest against patriarchy, they have theatrical performances on Women's Day celebrations when women folk would be abusing each other like man and wife and making the audiences feel how they feel. So this is the part of their folk protest. Like you come to the Holi celebration in India, where on the Holi day, on the day of Holi, the women folk are allowed to hit with a lat, with a stick to their men, and the men folk will have to bear with that. So, folk form as protest is a part of the folklore research today. And taking those interesting stories from our social systems, from our cultural systems, we have created a pedagogy of folklore. Myths are different from folk tales. In many other ways, myths are generally stories that explain the origin of life and the universe. Many myths deal with gods and goddesses or chivalrous heroes, heroines. Myths of such nature are commonly associated with institutionalized religions such as Hinduism, Christianity, and others. But folklore is not institutionalized. It doesn't have a religion. Folklore, is very, very flexible. When I was writing a chapter on for my MEG 16 MA English course, I wrote a chapter on the Paraja tribes. Look at them, how flexible and progressive they are in the Paraja tribal groups. The author, the novelist, writes that there are two girls, Jilly and Billy, and they have a carnival, a folk festival they have. And in the night, all girls will be dancing on one side, all boys would be dancing on the other side. And whenever a boy and a girl would like each other, then the boy can go take the girl, hold the hand of the girl, dance with her. And if the girl says no to that, no, I don't want to dance, then the boy cannot do anything about it. It's the power is given to the girl to say yes to dance with the boy. So that is the folk custom in the Paraja tribe. Then after the dance, song, music, and the carnival, the boy and the girl, they can spend a night in a cottage given to them by the tribal community. And if they are satisfied and happy with each other that night, then next morning they will announce their marriage. If they're not happy with each other, they will say no to the marriage tomorrow morning. So look at the progressive thinking, the flexibility of the folk traditions, unlike our conventional contemporary social setups. So folk societies are very progressive, very flexible, very, very realistic. So those things from those tribal communities, matriarchal societies, flexible social systems and customs and cultural systems, they are taken into consideration. And an important difference between folk tales and myths is with regard to time. Unlike folk tales, myths are explanations of origin of time and the universe. Most myths generally explain it in terms of time sequence, giving a sequence of what happened and when it happened. For example, in the Hindu origin, myths, the concept of yug, you understand, yugas or ages is a specific time sequence. One of the most common origins of myths is that of time of the 10 incarnations or avatars of Lord Vishnu. 10 incarnations of Lord Vishnu, one by one. So each avatar has a time period. But folk tales don't have that kind of time period. They are timeless. They have continuity. When I talk about oral written continuum, I'm talking about a kind of continuity. So in many tribal and oral belief systems, origin is often explained with reference to nature such as the sun and the moon, wind or water or natural phenomena. Folklore is very connected to the natural phenomena. The role of an individual or a family or a community is associated with the process of emergence and subsequent spread of human habitation across the geographical spaces, isn't it? So these individuals or families or communities are not historical in nature. They are ahistorical. They are creations of a people's faith, a people, I said, and the belief systems, and they belong to the oral traditions. This is what we call the oral written nexus. I'm using the word nexus repeatedly, as well as continuum. Don't ask me questions about nexus. You please think about it. If I'm right or wrong, I might be wrong, but I'm using this term because I find it very, very complicated. It creates a kind of a spider web in my mind when I talk about the oral, written, written, oral. So to problematize that, the so-called nexus, one has to emphasize the nature of the narratives, the function of the narratives, and the social context of the narratives. Some of my researchers are working on their PhD on the nature, function, and the social context. One of my research scholars from Northeast India, he came to me with a synopsis on, well, I'm a hard taskmaster when it comes to research. Dr. Shivaji will tell you more about it. And so the student came to me with a synopsis on the Northeast folklore and folk life, and I found it a bit sketchy. I said, when you want to do research under my supervision, you have to come back to me after 1 year. And within this 1 year, you have to study structuralism, post-structuralism, new historicism, and cultural materialism, and gender studies as the 5 theories, and you have to be well versed with that. Secondly, the Northeast folk texts written in Assamese, which I somehow understand, but not everyone will understand that. So you have to translate those yourself from Assamese to English, and I published those books. Well, I can publish also. I have associations with a lot of publishers. So I published those books in English. So the next year when the student came to me, he came well versed with arms and ammunitions of 2 translated novels from Assamese to English, and well versed with new historicism and cultural materialism to me. And the student did a PhD. And today his contribution is multifaceted. He's contributed to the translation studies of India from Assamese to English. He contributed to folklore research in India. And then he contributed also to the comparative literature, comparative studies. So when you do research on folklore studies, you have to be multitasking. You have to do a lot of things together. You have to do research, teaching, translation, and you have to be a performer to some extent. So, okay, so now when you ask me to talk about the relation between the verbal and the non-verbal folk forms, I can give you case studies of the textual performances on folklore, and so that you can understand the oral written continuum. The basic idea of the continuum and the nexus is transformation of the traditions from oral to written and vice versa in India. The subject of the oral written continuum refers to the relationship observed by the folklorists between the oral and the written traditions. Although the 2 traditions, because of their analytical characteristics, are supposed to be 2 opposing and incompatible entities, their existence and interactions in between or many oral occasions are found to be in the pattern of the 2-way traffic. It's a 2-way traffic, oral, written, written, oral, which I have been telling you. So which means one is influential and complementary to the other. Oral and written are influential and complementary to the other. And in the oral Ramayans, for example, the line of demarcation between the oral and the written cultural tradition is blurred into a continuum where it is difficult to distinguish when and where the oral and written ends and the other tradition begins, and especially when their textual performances narrated in contrast to the written counterparts. But there is also the oral written nexus, which is a continuum as well as a distortion. I emphasize distortion. Many of the standard comparisons between oral and written and literate cultures are flawed. They are also flawed. When you are a folklorist, you always have the fear of doing some research which is flawed. In order to be flawless, you really have to work hard. You have to think from your brain, not from your heart. So when I became a folklorist in the beginning, before 15 years, I was thinking from my heart. And now I think with my brains, I think with my conscience when I talk about folklore research. And writing doesn't replace oral continuum. It is merely another channel of communication substituting for the oral only in certain contexts, but at the same time developing the new ones. And the folklorists have to be extremely careful with this while bringing folklore to the university tables, that it should not be flawed, it should be authentic research. Many places, at many seminars and conferences, sometimes people bring some folk songs and folk tales to me and tell me, ma'am, is it authentic? What is the source? So dear students, if you're a folklorist, try to do authentic research and you must find the origin of the individual authorship, the literary pieces and the anonymous pieces, and you have to create and recreate, you have to examine and re-examine. Known unknown individuals will be there in due course of time. You have to know them, only then you can use them as a part of your research. While interpreting this issue of tradition, of folk tradition and individual talent, I'm reminded about T.S. Eliot. As a student of literature, I'm reminded of Eliot, who says that no poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value any artist alone. You must set him for contrast in the comparison among the dead. So the folk artists who are dead, you have to put your research as comparison and contrast with them. Only then you can create any folklore research. The demarcation, the line of distinction, the binary between the oral and written tradition in the real cultural manifestations are highly fragile. I, being a folklorist myself, I know how fragile I am. They're highly fragile, and I'm in a very, very complicated situation. I cannot say anything in absolute terms. I cannot present a folk tradition to you and say that in absolute terms. So for that, I have to do research. So that is why if you are a folklorist, you have to be a field study researcher. You have to go from place to place. And instead of a rigid line of segregation, there should be a continuum between both the traditions when you are a folklorist. So you have to be flexible and rigid at the same time. And the well-known anthologies of stories such as the Brihad Katha, Panchatantra, the great epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, when you think about those, the oral circulation, which later on became the written text, you have to also think about their continuum. So many of the classical performing art forms in the current times, which are called classical because of the presence of the written regulatory scripts and the written texts that governed the arts, they went through such types of transformations. Now look at the folk, not just literature, look at the folk other forms like the dance forms. Okay, so I belong to Odisha. So when you talk about the Odissi dance forms, I am a classical dancer myself, Odissi dancer myself. So when you talk about the Odissi dance as an important classical dance form, you have to know that its origin dates back to the folk dances. There were Gotipua dances. A boy, Gotipua dance was performed by a boy disguised as a girl, because there was a time when girls were not allowed to dance, to give performances on the stage. So boys were disguised, dressed up as girls, and they were giving Gotipua dance. Later on, the Mahari and the Devadasi dance forms were amalgamated, were merged with the Gotipua dance, and the Mahari and Devadasi dance forms were performed in the Jagannath temple. Then came the most recent classical Odissi dance form. So from Gotipua to Mahari to Devadasi to Odissi, you look at any kind of Bharatanatyam or any kind of classical dance form today, which is so very prestigious, they date back to some kind of folk dance. Similarly, any classical or modern literature, they date back to the folk literature. They have originated from the folk dance. You look at the Valmiki Ramayana or the Ramcharitmanas, they have borrowed stories from the folk Ramayans. There is one book, South India, edited by Paula Richman, which I have used as a part of my course material. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Am I
Yes, ma'am.
audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, I was getting a
Yes,
call.
yes,
Sorry.
you're audible.
Fine. So, there is one poem, Lakshmana's Love. Everyone has anxieties. That is a folk poem, which Paula Richman has taken in her book and the Ramayana in modern South India. So in that, what happens, Lord Ram, Lakshman and Sita, they come back from the forest to Ayodhya, and they are seated on the throne, and the court is in the process, the day one. And then suddenly Lakshman laughs aloud. He bursts into a laughter. Has padta hai Lakshman जोर से. And then everyone has anxieties. It's a folk poem. Everyone is anxious. Vibhishan thinks he is laughing at me, that I ditched my brother. Hanuman thinks he's laughing at me because I brought the entire mountain. I could not know the medicine. And Ram thinks he's laughing at me because maybe I accepted my wife, though she stayed in somebody's house for 10 months. Bharat and Shatrugna are anxious. They are thinking maybe Lakshman Bhaiya is laughing at us, that we became the kings, powerful, because by virtue of her mother. So everyone has anxieties. Angad is thinking that I am working with my chacha even after my father's death. So that anxiety is going on in the folk poem. And then Lord Ram is very angry. He is telling that now Lakshman should be beheaded because he laughed in the court. And then what happens? Sita says, no, no, he should be given a chance to speak why he was laughing in the court. Then Lakshman says, I was laughing at my destiny. When I left Ayodhya 14 years back, I called Nidra Devi, the goddess of sleep, and I requested her that my share of sleep, mera sara neend, should be given away to my wife, beautiful wife, Urmila, so that she can sleep for 14 years. She will not miss me. And now I came back, and now I want to start a conjugal life with my beautiful wife. And now, in a corner of this court, goddess of sleep, Nidra Devi, is here to return me my 14 years of sleep. Now, if I sleep for 14 years, what kind of a beautiful conjugal life I am going to lead with my wife? So I'm laughing at my destiny. So Lord Ram regretted, Arey, my brother, he loves me so much. He took so much care of me in the forest, and I was going to behead him. So, in the folk tales, in the folk poetry, Lord Ram is presented like a common man. He has his anxieties, he has his insecurities, anger. He is not like Maryada Purushottam, who is above all kinds of trivial human emotions. And then he asks his Guru Vasisht, what should I do now? I was going to punish my dear brother. He says, okay. So for 14 years, Lakshman pressed your feet and you slept. So tonight you press his feet and let Lakshman sleep. So Lord Ram agreed to do that. And then he pressed his feet and Lakshman slept for one night. And next morning he woke up and he started a good conjugal life with his wife, because Lord Ram and Sita beseeched, requested goddess of sleep, Nidra Devi, to spare Lakshman from 14 years sleep anymore. They said, give him natural sleep. Let this poor boy start his life. So that is how, everyone has anxieties. Lakshmana's laugh. So those kind of interesting poems on small human emotions are given in the folk literature, in the folk poetry, in the folk tales. There is another story in this book where, Sita's three sisters, Urmila and two other sisters, Bharat and Lakshmana's wife, they request Sita that we have heard that Ravan was very, very handsome. So will you please narrate us about his beauty? Then Sita says that I'm a wife, so I never looked at the face of another man. I only looked at his feet when he came to request me to marry him. I just looked at his feet. So they said, okay, fine, you just draw the feet of Ravan. So she drew the feet of Ravan, only the toe of Ravan. Somewhere in the folk tales, it's written that the shape of the toe was somehow the shape of the phallus. So it has some sexual undertone, that Sita probably had some kind of respect or attraction or something towards Ravan. It's given in one of the folk tales. I'm not saying it's an oral tale. And then the sisters left Sita and she was very sleepy. So she drew the feet of the toe of Ravan and somehow she slept on that. So she slept. And then Lord Ram comes to see that his wife is asleep on the painting, the picture of the toe of Ravan, and he is very angry. Then he calls Lakshman and says that leave her in the forest. So those kind of interesting oral tales, oral poetry is there in these stories, in the oral tales, which are not possible in the classical Ramayans and the classical Mahabharats. So it's just, when I read those oral tales, I read a lot of folklore. Yeah. Also, I read the Vedas and Upanishad and Bhagavad Gita and everything. I am a voracious reader of classical and folk literatures. So when I read the classical literatures, I have a lot of respect for our cultural heritages. And when I read the folk tales, my mind is stimulated looking at the interesting collective imagination of a people. People will imagine such things, that if I'm drawing, I'm painting the feet of somebody and then I'm sleeping on that foot of somebody and sleeping on that, probably that people can think that I have respect and love for that person. So these kind of human emotions, weakness. Sita also had weaknesses in a folk tale. So she slept on the painting herself, and Lakshman was ordered to throw her in the forest because she slept on the painting of the toe of Ravan. So those kind of folk tales are there. So do you accept my truth, my lord? That is one story. Poem. Everyone has anxieties. Lakshman's love is a poem. So those kind of interesting poems and literature is there in our folk tales. So when you bring folklore to the university tables, you have to also be a storyteller. Folklorist has to be a storyteller. When I wrote one of my chapters in the MA folklore program, folklore as healing. When I was writing that, I was teaching that chapter. I came across a case study of the Jagannath culture and folklore. Lord Jagannath, I belong to Odisha basically. So Lord Jagannath, who has hands up to this incomplete limbs, his hands are incomplete, his legs are incomplete. So it associates him with the disabled, the differently abled. So he has connection with the differently abled. So the Lord of the universe has incomplete limbs. He doesn't have legs and feet, but still he can be the Lord of the universe. Then he has black skin, completely dark skin. So his dark skin connects him to the dark skinned people. You cannot distinguish between the fair and the dark. Everyone is beautiful. Like Lord Jagannath, the darkest person is the most beautiful person. So the dark skinned person can be beautiful. So there is no distinction between the fair and the dark. And then the food cooked in the Lord Jagannath temple is cooked by the tribals. So there is no caste feeling there. So everyone is equal. And so the tribals will cook the food on the earthen pots, mitti ka pot, earthen pots, boiled food without oil and ghee, without oil, without chalk. They will cook the most environment friendly, ecology friendly food. Okay, so this is how. So when you write folklore or you do folklore research, you have to connect yourself to ecology. You have to understand the popular imaginations of a people, the cultural imaginations of a people, and to problematize my tension. I'm using the word tension. My tension when I'm a folklorist is the culture elements. Do the poems belong to the high culture or to the so-called low culture? That is my tension. I leave it to you to decide. If the poems I talked about now, everyone has anxieties, Lakshmana's love, do you accept my truth? So do they belong to the high culture or the low culture? Or for that matter, is there anything called high and low in Indian literary scenario? You have to think about that. So when I conclude, I will talk about how there is no Margi Deshi dichotomy in Indian culture. And the final picture I will give you is when we bring folklore to the Indian universities, we have to think about a few things. Just go to, once again I will reiterate, you go to the UGC NET syllabus and also MA FCS syllabus that I have designed for IGNOU, and also MEG 16 syllabus. You will find quite a few things that are similar. So maybe that was my way of presenting both the things. That an MA program will be helpful for the students to do that UGC NET, and the UGC NET students will find the MA program that I have designed very, very interesting. So to sum up, the folklore research has brought a new issue to the university table. UGC NET examination is the greatest testimony to what I claim here. Just go and look at it. Ecofeminism, please read that. Eco-criticism, read the gender discourse, feminism, masculinity studies, and queer theories, LGBTQ, queer theories. So queer folklore, queer characters of folklore. And then read gynocriticism, the Russian protest literature, and the Latmar festivals in India. About that I told you. Disability studies, Ashtavakra stories, disability studies and folklore. Environmental studies, new historicism and cultural materialism, folklore and multimediality, folklore and interdisciplinarity, folklore and anthropology, folklore and subaltern studies, folklore as performative and visual culture, the concept of diffusion, Benfei's migration theory, Egyptian school of folklore, feminism, Finnish school, historical geographical methods, folklore and memory culture, which we call memo culture, folklore and protest literature, folklore and inclusivity, folklore as a redemption, folklore as a healing, then syntagmatic structuralism, paradigmatic structuralism, Vladimir Prop and Folklore of Russia, which Dr. Shivaji will talk more, post-structuralism and new histories and new hermeneutics, and deconstruction and post-colonialism, folklore in vernacular traditions, Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Persian literary texts. And then ultimately, I conclude in both the cases, in our MA programs and also in UGC NET, I conclude the possibility of the Indian folk poetics in future. What is the future of Indian folk poetics? I leave it open to all of you to discuss and tell me if you really find any future to the possibility of Indian folk research. Thank you.
Very much. Maybe no. Kiran ma'am, maybe you can turn on your mic. I think it's muted.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, now you're.
Okay. Thank you so much for delivering such an important, interesting, and informative talk on folklore, and for sharing and enlightening us with your experience while bringing folklore to the university tables, and lots of knowledge and unlimited terms related to folklore to our today's audience tables. Maybe now our audience will be interested in discussing with you about this very important, useful, and interesting academic program developed by you and other course writers for Indira Gandhi National Open University. And maybe our students and colleagues want to clear their doubts on this interesting program on folklore studies, folk literature. We have here our experts on literature, folklorists also. They are present here today. So now the floor is open, the virtual floor is open for discussion. Please, if you have any questions. Dr. Sonu Seni?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Vikram, can we help us? Like I can see questions.
Or maybe
in the chat box.
in chats, no one has written. No one, yeah, we don't have any questions here. So
No, ma'am.
they can ask directly. Okay. You can raise your virtual hands.
Indu Shekhar has a question.
Okay. Okay.
Hello, ma'am.
Indu, maybe you can unmute your mic. Yes, please.
I think I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are unmuted.
Okay, so thank you, ma'am, for such wonderful lecture. It's a very informative and like a very thought-provoking. But actually, I taught a course on Indian Russian folktale. So there I found there are a lot of like when we talk about Russian folktales, there are a lot of different categories like fables, or even when we talk about European folktales as well, there are a lot of distinction between folktales and then myth, fables, anecdotes, and legends or legenda in Russian. So do we have such clear and like Prop talk about a very clear distinction about among these categories? So do we have certain kind of these kind of like classification or some categories in Indian folk when we're talking about Indian folktale as well? I know you talked about a bit of fit like myth and Indian like folktale, but like for other anecdotes or like fables or legends, so is there any clear classification in Indian folktale?
See, there is a thin line of distinction between classical, folk, and modern, which I already want the scholars to look into if you really want to get into folklore research. And like in any kind of literature, any conventional literature, you have distinction between fables and parables and modern tales or anything for that matter. Folklore also has those distinctions, and you have to understand that is where you as a researcher will have to the role, play the role. So you have to distinguish between the kinds of folk tales which are parables and fables and ethical tales or whatever. Because, you know, what happens when it is folklore, people have very sweeping and very general kind of ideas. They think everything folklore is oral, everything written is not folk anymore. So this is where you have to play your important role and define those, I feel.
Okay. Uh, one more question. Like when we talk about, you were talking about, like there are some recent new folklore like researchers who talk about influence of written to oral. When we're talking about folklore research, we like they say that the influence came from not from oral to written. They are not clearly opposing that idea, but they are saying that for written word also influenced in lot of ways the oral way, oral folktale. So do you agree with this view, or
This
is
is
it?
exactly what I said when I talked about the oral written continuum and the oral written nexus. I told that it is both ways, that the oral literatures have influenced the written literatures, and later on the written literatures are carried forward to different cultures and different languages through the oral medium. So the oral written continuum and the oral written nexus is very, very important in folklore research. Both the oral and the written literatures, they influence each other. They are
So
influential.
that like how does it influence like our like in defining the folklore, how it affects our understanding of the folktale? Because like folktale or folklore is like orality is on the most basic concept or like this fundamental aspect of that definition. Like if we although if we cannot define it in a very strict manner, but
So what you're trying to say, I'm getting it. You must have heard something like the hermeneutics of translation.
yes,
In the hermeneutics of translation, what we talk about is translation is always very, very challenging. Whenever you translate something from one language to another, a part of the original writing would be anyway lost in the process of translation, in any kind of translation. So the role of the translator is to retain the originality, to be faithful to the original text. And when it is the translation of folklore, it is even doubly marginalized. Like I gave you examples that I understand English, Hindi, Odia, and Bangla, or Assamese
yes.
for that matter. If I'm trying to take a folktale of Tamil literature to English, then I have to use some translator of Tamil literature or language who understands any of the languages that I know. So then that person will orally transmit that Tamil story to me in English or Hindi or Odia. So the translator has to be very, very careful, very faithful to the original text. So the hermeneutics of translation, which is a big, big challenge in any case, is even more so in case of folklore. That is why folklore research is a very challenging thing. That if you are a folklore researcher, your responsibility is multiple. It is multiplied into several times than an ordinary researcher, isn't it? Yeah,
Yes, of course, ma'am.
yeah, of course. I'm glad that you are taking so much interest.
Oh, I studied. I will not like read much, but like I have read quite a few. But like I'm really interested in folklore. Like West has a clear like lot of books and everything. But like when we're talking about Indian material, there is a lot of missing links because first is linguistics like boundaries. We have a lot of boundaries. Like I just only know Hindi and English and the same. So there are a lot of south, down south, and like northeast has a lot rich history of like folklore, and
Okay,
so yeah,
great, wonderful.
that's all my question. Thank you,
I wish you all the best as a folklorist.
thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. If no one has
May
questions,
I
then
ask
Dr.
a
Rajiv
question,
would
ma'am?
like to add something.
I have, I have,
You have a
I have
question?
a question.
Yeah, please.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, first of all, like it's a continuation of the question which is asked by Dr. Indu Shekhar. The oral literature, there is a concept like oral literature, right? And the folk literature is also based on the oral. So, although there are distinctions, like generally oral literature is considered like which is based on the truth or which is based on the true stories. Whereas like folk tales or folklore, what I understood that they are generally can be based on fiction. So how do you distinguish them? Like how do you put a line, or how do you frame these both the terms in terms of literature and oral literature, folklore and oral literature?
See, I really don't understand what exactly you are trying to say, but well, if I am taking it correctly, then you are trying to know what is the difference between orality and literature. I think my entire lecture was on that. That there is a
No, not exactly that part, but oral literature, and there is a concept like oral literature, like which is based on testimonies, for example. And there is literature like which is based on folk tales, like which carries forward from one generation to another generation. That is also called like oral literature.
right.
Like for example, the other side of silence, which is written by Urvashi Bhotalia, which is based on the testimonies. Surpa Mukherjee's on Bhopal, like voices from Bhopal, and some others also, like which are based on truth events and true tragedies. In that way, just wanted.
Fine. You see, the same answer I would give, like I gave to the previous question, that there is a continuity between the oral and the written literatures in Indian folkloristic. There is no major difference between the Margi and the Deshi traditions, which is the elite and the folk traditions in Indian folkloristic. Unlike the Western theories, where there is a major difference between the great and the little traditions. For example, in the Shakespearean plays, you will always find that the heroes or the protagonists are kings or generals. Eriksha Puller will never be the protagonist in a Shakespearean tragedy. But when you come to Indian literature, be it folk literature or classical or any kind of literature, there is a grandeur when it is about the classical heroes. And also there is a dignity of the folk heroes, Bishra Munda, or those kind of, you look at the nationalistic period, Jhansi ki Rani Lakshmi Bai, Khoob ladi mardani wo to Jhansi wali Rani thi, those kind of folk poetry, if you look at those. So those kind of poems which are oral, passed on from generation to generation, they also have an epic grandeur, epic dignity. So in Indian folklore research, I do not really find any clear distinction between the classical folk and the modern. They are interchangeable, they exchange hands with each other. So your challenge per se, or maybe my challenge, is to understand those things. We have to understand the basic difference, the research points between the classical, the folk, and the modern literatures, and then address those issues. That's what I would like to say.
Okay, ma'am, sorry, can I ask, add here something?
Just ma'am, I think I could not explain it in a clear way. I'm looking for the, your distinction between not the folklore, but in the folklore, like in between folklore and oral literature, which is there today as a genre. Oral literature, that means like which is the literature which is written based on some oral testimonies.
Yeah.
Sonu sir, can I add here?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know your
Yes.
question. I think Sonu sir wanted to ask this question, that can we consider all kind of oral literature as a folk tale or not? Like, can we consider all the literature that exists in oral form that can be considered as a folk tale? Can we consider or study it as a folk tale? Or should it be studied at?
I'll ask you one question. Do you consider all kind of written stuff as literature? Some pamphlet on the wall, something on the roads, something lying somewhere in a restaurant? Do you consider everything as literature? No. In order
Like,
to
if we go by broader definition, like it is considered as a part of literature. If we go by a broader definition,
everything can be a part of the oral literatures, but any oral literature that has universality, that has a universal approach, that belongs to a cultural system, that talks about a people, about a culture, about a generation, about a way of life, only that can be a part of your oral literature. Not everything can be oral literature. Like not everything can be written literature. Not everything can be oral literature per se, right? Yeah.
Sorry, Sonu sir, like, I don't know. I think
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Told your.
May I ask one question?
Yeah, sure, please. please.
Yeah, you were talking about intangible expressions,
more
right?
questions from the
And you talked about music, the gharana, the folk gharana, which is there. Is Photochitro and the other art form also intangible expressions? Are they also?
Yes, yes, intangible expressions. The tradition of a transference of Patachitra or
Yeah.
those folk paintings or those paintings, transferring those as an art form to the next generation belongs to the intangible cultural heritage.
Okay. And what are other intangible expressions other than the music, art? What else?
Music, art, painting, and then dance or
Dance or yeah, dance form also.
and,
Yeah.
and cuisine, cooking. I said cooking, cuisine,
Yeah.
and medicine. All those, the knowledge system, transference of the knowledge system from one generation to another belongs to the intangible
And the
cultural.
familial, I think it goes from one family to other family. That is
And
mainly.
sometimes people can be very, very possessive about their gharana. They will not
Yeah.
teach it to anyone outside,
Yes.
isn't it? Do
Yes.
you also do that?
No, but yes, I understood your point.
Got it? Nice, very nice, interesting.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so
If
much.
any other question or people would like to comment, Dr. Shivaji is here. He may like to add something.
Dr. Shivaji Bhaskar. He was a little busy with his phone actually,
Okay.
talking to someone. Yeah, maybe. He's not there, I think. Left or yeah.
Yes, ma'am, he's not.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. So thank you so much. Now I'll request our chairperson if he wants to say a few words.
No,
Of course,
very
to thank.
interesting.
Yeah, it was.
No, yeah, definitely. Thank you, Professor Nandini Sahu.
Thank you.
Very interesting lecture, very captivating. We were listening, like, learning a lot of things, new things. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Now
yes.
I
Now
would
we can move
request
ahead. For
Professor.
the official.
Yeah, Professor
Yes, yes.
Ranjana Banerjee, I request you to kindly propose vote of thanks, please.
thank you, Dr. Kiran Singh Verma. Good evening. On behalf of the Center of Russian Studies, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our guest speaker, Professor Nandini Sahu, for taking time out from her busy schedule and sharing her expertise on folklore. How beautifully you have defined the various forms and features of folklore, the commonalities that are traced in different folk traditions of from different parts of the world. You talked about the baul, who sings on the train, and I have experienced that. And you were talking about the field work. I could understand what you meant to say, that when we hear a folk song on the stage, somebody just in a sari and singing it, and when we hear that baul singing with his ektara, the ghungru, the colorful dress he's wearing, the effect is absolutely different. Yes, so you very beautifully explained it. Thank you so much. Without any doubt, your lecture was gripping, thought-provoking, and very, very informative. We are thankful to you for enlightening each one of us with your knowledge and expertise. I would like to thank our chairperson, Dr. Arunim Bandopadhyay, for his constant support and encouragement to his colleagues in organizing the online events and webinar. Thank you so much. This webinar and the other webinars would not have been possible without the tireless work and painstaking effort of two of our colleagues, Dr. Kiran Singh Verma and Dr. Sonu Saini, in organizing the webinars. Ever enthusiastic, ever ready to work for the cause of the center, the cause for the students, my heartfelt gratitude to them. I would also like to add, thanks to Dr. Saini, we did not even for once feel that conducting an online program is challenging. We never felt that. It always went very smoothly. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all our respected colleagues from different universities, from different parts of the world, and our beloved students, scholars from different universities for their active participation. Thank you so much for joining and making this webinar and a successful event. Thank you so much.
I would just like to add, we are very grateful to our one of our coordinators, Professor Ranjana Banerjee, who is always supportive and encouraging. She always encourages us. So that is why we are organizing all these all online webinars with her kind support.
The joint effort. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we hope to, look forward to your lectures in future also.
Yes,
Yes.
yes. It was the longest, I think, webinar today. Not
very-
today. We had
very
this is the 10th one. We had 9. This is the longest one. It was really interesting. That is why our audience, they wanted you to continue. See, this is happening for the first time. So I said, I was just sitting quiet and listening to you. Of course, it was interesting for everyone. Thank
Okay.
you so much, Professor Nandini Sahu.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you. We enjoyed thoroughly with our colleagues from IGNOU.
oh, see, he's sitting with our colleague, Dr. Ajay Kumar Karnati.
Nandini
Now
ma'am,
he's here.
many congratulations. He's here.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye. Bye.
It's wonderful meeting all of you. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you very much. Thank you very much,
Please.
Professor Sahu, for this
So
very
much.
interesting webinar.
Oh,
Thank you
yeah.
very much.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Collaborate with me. All of you, please collaborate with me, contribute. I have enough folklore research with me. I would like to work with good scholars like you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So email me, collaborate with me. A lot of collaboration work can happen.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.